Welcome back to the stage of history, young historians. Today we kick off Unit 2 with our video summary and highlights for Chapter 18 on conflicts and absolutism in Europe. While this chapter does start to stagnate for us a little bit, we've now been dealing with Europeans for 4 consecutive chapters. It actually contains a good number of my favorite figures in history. William the Silent, Peter the Great, Queen Elizabeth I, all are personal favorites of mine that you will be introduced to in class and that you read a little bit about in Chapter 18. My hope is that between the very detailed chapter that you read, which introduces you to a plethora of people and places, that this video lecture will start to put some questions in your mind about the material. We will then revisit many of those questions in class as we spend a day each spotlighting different rulers and kingdoms. Without further ado, our table of contents. Unlike last chapter where I protested the textbook title of The Age of Exploration by adding my modifying claim that it was the Age of European Exploration, Chapter 18 is more or less exactly what it says on the tin. Conflict, both military and social struggles, and absolutism, strong leaders with near universal control over their states, in Europe. We will see a few fleeting moments of peace, and we will see a few governmental constraints, but mostly here we're taking a look at just what it says right there. And there's no better example of the chaos of the time period than the 30 Years' War, seen in the pillaging of a farm in the background, so naturally that will be among our first topics. Lesson 1, Europe in Crisis. There's 2 things that I want to take a look at. You know I'll never pass up an opportunity to make it sound like I'm smarter than your textbook, which I assure you that I'm not. So I'm going to challenge a claim that they floated in the text that the 30 Years' War was the last of the religious wars. Stop me if you've heard this one, but I'm going to try to sell you that on the fact that the war actually had less to do with religion and was actually more about politics. Secondly, for Lesson 1, I'm going to want to flesh out the story that the book gives you, flesh out the version of the witch trials that the book gives you, by reading about the story of a woman who stood accused of witchcraft in the 17th century, the mother of astronomer Johannes Kepler. Hopefully by sharing her narrative and giving a little bit more context to the witch trials, we'll gain an understanding of the senselessness of the witch trials of the era and how those were often proxies for social and religious conflicts that had nothing to do with the actual dark arts. For Lesson 2, on the English Civil War, we're going to go right into my area of expertise and we're going to talk about political philosophy. The end of that section introduced the figures of John Locke and Thomas Hobbes. I'm going to flesh out their philosophies on government a little bit and introduce a third challenger, Jean-Jacques Rousseau. Thirdly, a brief look at something that they didn't share with you about Prussian history in your brief introduction to it in this chapter, the foundation of the Prussian education model. Your book gives a brief shout-out to Prussian military strength and the Prussian military model, but doesn't connect that to something that you are familiar with, the function of the modern education system. If you like school the way it stands, thank a Prussian. If you dislike mandatory education from ages from 5 through 13, well, get over it and thank a Prussian anyways. The pros and cons of the Prussian education model in that slide. Lastly, as a spotlight on art and culture, we're going to take a look at the art of Caravaggio and inspect the similarities and important differences between the art of the Baroque period and the Renaissance, and I'll leave you with a question about what does Baroque art tell us about the time period it came from. We've already played that game with the Renaissance, so hopefully you will be able to work those same skills, and with me doing less of the talking and you doing more of the thinking, figure out what it is that Baroque art tells us about this time period. Well, there's our table of contents. Let's kick this puppy off with the 30 Years' War. Alright, we'll start with the 30 Years' War. There is no war that is more devastating and at the same time less understood in all of the Western tradition than the 30 Years' War. And there's a darn good reason why it isn't easily understood. It was a highly complicated conflict, and even with 400 years of hindsight, it's still tricky for us to pinpoint exactly what motivated all of the players involved in the war. We will not study the war itself in an excessive degree of detail. You will need to understand the elements of it that were laid out in your textbook, but it is important that we have a familiarity with the sides of the conflict and an appreciation for the devastation that it caused in Europe. However, most specifically, I want to take a moment and deal with the claim that this was the last of the religious wars. It's easy to see where the claim comes from. The war was fought between a Catholic alliance and a Protestant alliance, with the Catholic alliance being spearheaded, of course, by that Holy Roman Empire of German states. We talked about these during Chapter 16, that loose confederation of states under the leadership of Holy Roman Emperor Charles V, the King of Spain, which then naturally means that Spain was an ally of the Holy Roman Empire because they were not only devoutly Catholic, but because their rulers came from the same bloodline after Charles V had split his territorial holdings. Really, what you are looking at here for this Catholic alliance is the empires ruled by a... Alright, I'll go back and edit that and get this sentence in there. In fact, we can really go ahead and throw Austria in there too for good measure, because, again, we're dealing with the same bloodline. Really, what you're looking at for this Catholic alliance is the empires ruled by the Habsburg family, a family that was debatably the most powerful ruling family in Europe entering this war, given that they ruled not only the Holy Roman Empire, the Spanish Empire, and the Austrian Empire. It's debatably one of the most powerful ruling families in Europe entering this war, but it would undoubtedly be greatly reduced in its power leaving this war. Now, while the 1555 Peace of Augsburg, the one that had ended religious conflict to some extent in Germany, had to some extent ended conflicts between Catholics and Lutherans within the borders of the Holy Roman Empire, it did not resolve issues with non-Lutheran Protestants, most notably Calvinists, which soon bred rebellion and resistance in several Protestant nations and Protestant territories inside and adjacent to the Holy Roman Empire, in particular the Netherlands and Sweden. Although there were also Germanic territories like Saxony and Bohemia that still had a socio-economic axe to grind with the ruling noble class following the Peasants' War, with many still using religion as a guise under which they could take out their frustrations with their ruling class. You'll remember our brief talk on defenestrations in class. This is where we continue to see sweet, sweet lower-class justice being brought upon ruling powers. And naturally, if we're going to have an alliance of Protestants, then surely we are going to see England want to join too. Even though it's debatable to what degree the Anglican Church was even a Protestant faith at this point, and not just a rebranding of the Catholic Church, it's certainly interested in limiting the power of the Pope's golden boy, the Holy Roman Emperor, and therefore England is going to be willing to sign up for this conflict. But then we get a curious item to go alongside this Protestant alliance. France. France, under the leadership of Cardinal Richelieu, a cardinal in the Catholic Church, joins the conflict on the side of the Protestant rebels. Now, I'm going to oversimplify this and make it a little bit too clear, but I'm skeptical that it was a religious war when you had religious groups crossing sides to fight with the others. If we want to explain the motivations of the French in this conflict, if we want to explain why it is that His Red Eminence sides with the Calvinist rebels at the same time that he's trying to put down Calvinist rebels inside his own nation, we're going to need to read some politics into his motivation. Just like Lutheran princes of Chapter 16, what Richelieu is after is not religious freedom for Protestants to practice as they see fit. What he wants is for France to be more independent of the Pope and the Holy Roman Emperor's direct command. Last of the religious wars? Well, sure, if we ignore the fact that most of what was being fought about was the power of the Holy Roman Emperor. And at the end of the war, that power of the Holy Roman Empire would be thoroughly reduced, not just from the concessions that they made in the Peace of Westphalia at the end of the war, but more so because of the devastation that this war has on Central Europe. 8 million Europeans are killed in this war when you count the masses of people who died either in lootings or famines related to the war. Now, there were fewer than 80 million Europeans alive at the time of the war. More than 10% of the population of Europe is killed as a direct result of this war, a murky, convoluted, quasi-political, quasi-religious conflict that's impossible to fully understand. It certainly rivals World War I for the most senseless conflict in European history. A second important question for us then to ask is, why was this war so devastating? Well, as always, I've got a couple suggestions for you. As is always the case for the time period, the bigger killers than the musket and the sword will actually be disease and starvation. In particular, with the 30 Years' War, you're dealing with some problems of scale where army sizes had swollen and there wasn't a way to deal with the logistics related to commanding an army of that size yet. There is no such thing as sanitation in cities at this point, much less on the battlefield. It should be completely unsurprising to us that disease cut through the ranks of soldiers like a warm knife through butter, as it will in every war right up through World War I. Furthermore, there wasn't even a good way to feed troops other than to have them feed on whatever was available nearby. You have enough troops in an area for long enough, and pretty soon not only are the troops out of food, but whoever lives there is going to be starving as a result of the war too. In fact, while the toll of the war will be great for soldiers, they'll be perhaps greater for citizens. As we said in Chapter 15, most soldiers of this day were mercenaries. With the exception of the Prussians and a few other odd ducks, we don't get too many standing armies of disciplined men during this time period. And mercenaries need to get paid and are in this to make profit. As a way of paying their mercenaries, many armies of this time would simply let soldiers loot the cities that they sacked. The looting and crime that occurred in these cities was often far more devastating than anything that occurred on the battlefields, and given that mercenaries aren't pledged members of any one national army, it's very difficult to discipline such behavior during this time period. You can't necessarily court-martial an angry mob when they were hired to be an angry mob. The 30 Years' War, we could spend an entire school year on it, but our major takeaway should be that this is a continuation of the political struggles of the Protestant Reformation, once again dressed up as a religious conflict, and that this remains a stupid and terrible time to be alive in Europe, where senseless death absolutely surrounded everyday life. We move on from a topic that is underappreciated in world history to a topic that is perhaps over-dramatized. I'm sure very few of you could have provided details about the 30 Years' War, but most of you are aware that there is a point in history in which women were tried and executed on allegations of witchcraft, the so-called witch trial hysteria. It's important for us to note that while a cataclysmic event that was the 30 Years' War killed approximately 8 million people, only 40,000 will be executed for witchcraft over the 300-year period in which we claim that witch hunting was common. 40,000 people were killed by vending machines falling on them every hour. That's a fact. Why then is it that witchcraft and witch trials are seared into the consciousness of historians, and the 30 Years' War is such a convoluted mess? Well, a couple reasons I'd argue. Witch trials are a quick and easy thing to point to when you want to prove a point about the time period, and that point being that people were caught up in a religious fervor. The idea that 40,000 people were executed for a crime that they couldn't have possibly committed, because witches don't actually exist, points out to us that the morality of the time period bordered on a hysteria. Maybe another part of why we like to focus on witch trials is because it gives us gruesome stories to tell. After all, we remember the gruesome things, and there was little more gruesome about the time period than the punishment for witches. including hangings, beheadings, breaking people's backs over the wheel, and what would appear to be driving a stake through that one lady's eye. Yikes! No wonder this stuff gets headlines in history. It's pretty scary stuff. Mostly, though, what the witch trials show us about the time period is that minorities, in particular religious minorities, were hounded in their societies. Who was accused of witchcraft? Usually women, sure. Usually older, sure. But disproportionately, it was also religious minorities. We could back this up with a number of anecdotes, but I'll leave us to just one, the mother of Johannes Kepler. Kepler, as you hopefully know from your science classes, was one of the preeminent astronomers of his day, known for mathematically justifying that the sun is the center of the solar system and not the Earth, and creating the laws for planetary motion that explain this fact. Kepler, however, was also a committed Protestant, a Lutheran, in a portion of Germany where it was still dangerous to be a religious reformer. When Kepler's rivals couldn't go after Kepler himself, after all he's a brilliant mathematician and post-Peace of Augsburg he is allowed to practice his religion, they'll start to stir up rumors that they heard his mother is a witch. In a story I won't actually share because I am concerned about the time length of this video, Kepler's mother goes through one of the sorriest excuses for a trial ever. The people accusing her drag a woman into her house who is pretending to be sick, and then they demand that she use her witch powers to cure her. When she says she doesn't have any witch powers, they threaten her with death for being a witch unless she saves the woman. When she says that doesn't change the fact that she still doesn't have any witch powers, they present her with a spell written out for her and tell her to read it. When she does, they reveal that the whole thing was a test to reveal that she was truly a witch, and they take her into custody for practicing witchcraft. She would later die during torture when they were seeking a confession. The evil that men do, people. That's the Cliff's Notes version of Kepler's witch. But if we ever hit a dead spot in class next week, remind me that I didn't give you the full thing in 4-part harmony, and I'll make sure to fully depress you about the evil that men do then. Moving away from human tragedy, there's a section at the end of Chapter 18, Lesson 2 that I want to hit on because it deals with another one of my specialties. After a chapter about the English Civil War, the very discreet and seemingly pointlessly circuitous conflict in which the English monarchy is abolished and then restored within a generation, they tack on this section at the end about political philosophers, John Locke and Thomas Hobbes. Now you're getting into my territory as a political historian. What I want to do is take the information there and introduce it in a handy-dandy framework. Also, I want to introduce a third figure into the mix that I feel is relevant to both the framework and to the materials that we have looked at in our current chapter from Bartolomé de las Casas. So, the big question that we are dealing with here is we are taking a step back from all existing experience with government and asking the question of, what's a government supposed to be doing anyways? It's an important question to ask, because what a government's job is influences what makes a successful government. Well, Englishman Thomas Hobbes is writing in the midst of the English Civil War, a time period of great chaos, as you read in England, ECW, ECW, and he sets this up as a 3-part question. In establishing what a government's job is, you need to first determine, according to Thomas Hobbes, what mankind would be like without a government. Then, you need to determine what problems you want government to fix from that previous situation. Then, you decide what government would be best equipped to do that. For Hobbes, the answers to these questions are clear. What is mankind like naturally? Which is to say, what is mankind like without a government? Well, Hobbes has seen mankind without a government during the chaos of the English Civil War, and he concludes that if men were left to their own devices, life would be nasty, brutish, and short. I've been told that there's a movie about this called The Purge. Well, in Thomas Hobbes' world, The Purge isn't a horror film, it's a documentary. That's what mankind would be like if given half a chance. What's a government's job then? Well, it's to protect you from the other rampaging beasts that you call people who make up society. We don't want the purge. We don't want to see a post-apocalyptic society where man is constantly at war with each other. Therefore, we give up our rights to a government that will protect us. If the government's one job, then, is to protect its citizen, there is no better government than an absolute monarchy. Give all powers over to the nation, and the nation will keep you safe from outside invasion and internal crime. It's not a bad deal if you, like Hobbes, believe that life is to be valued above all else, and without government your life would constantly be endangered. It's not really a sophisticated political philosophy until we strike on the one profound element to it. Where does this absolute monarch, where does this king get his power? Not from God, as most monarchs claim during this time period. He gets it instead from the people. The people need him to wield that power. Tuck that claim under your hat for a few chapters. We'll revisit it again this chapter, but it will come out in a big way in Chapter 21. Not surprisingly, with a simple framework like this that's relatively easy to follow, other people start to fill in their own blanks, and none are more significant than John Locke. Locke is another Englishman, and he looks at the works of Hobbes and claims that people wouldn't actually be all that bad naturally. People are, if you observe them, according to John Locke, very rational. They do the things that are in their best interest, and they create arrangements that benefit them. People are problem solvers. People negotiate. They make pacts. They find ways to create a social circle that will work to benefit them. People will find a way to make society work, as long as society has a fundamental fairness to it, and as long as the people have certain basic rights. According to John Locke, these rights are the rights to life, to liberty, and to property. As long as mankind has some kind of education and some kind of rights, he's capable of using his little chimp brain to come up with solutions to problems. As a result, then, you want a government that lets people do what they're best at and that will protect them from being abused, either by each other or by their government. Boy howdy, that sounds like a representative democracy to me. That sounds like the justification for a democratic form of government. No surprise that much of our nation's political theory is tied to John Locke's thoughts and writings. Now, the odd duck who was left out of this section and left out of the textbook in this section is a Swiss thinker, Jean-Jacques Rousseau. Remember what Bartolomé de las Casas wrote about the natives? What the Dutch writer wrote about the Africans? Some societies are better off when there isn't a social structure in place. This is what Rousseau believed about humanity. If you look at humans in a primitive state, they're not greedy, they're not warlike, and no creature is fundamentally born wanting to be evil. Rousseau then says that the state of nature is that of a noble savage, of a good barbarian, like de las Casas was writing to us about. Rousseau then says that government is not our solution to the state of nature. Government is the problem that removes us from our natural state. Somewhere along the line, in our efforts to build societies, we instead instill in ourselves a corrupt love of money and material goods. According to Rousseau, the best form of government, then, would be reducing government down to either some sort of tribal system or merely to a utopian understanding where we all respect the concept that no one has rights to claim property here on this earth. This slide is a ton of political theory to digest. 3 radically different views of how government should function and 3 seemingly reasonable justifications. All of them start off with logical observations about humanity and then come to a conclusion about what societal ills government is supposed to avoid. If you follow far enough down Locke's path, you get to modern-day American government. But if you follow far enough down the lines of Hobbes or Rousseau, you get an Adolf Hitler or a Vladimir Lenin. Much of modern political ideology can be understood by simply getting the frameworks of these 3 men. We will revisit this in class. What I want to do right now is just put the seed in your head, but these 3 are going to need to go on the got-to-know list for us moving forward, or else nothing wonderful can happen with political theory. Two last quick thoughts for this lecture, and the first one is a toss-away section in Lesson 3 about Prussia. Your book makes mention of Prussia as an emerging German state with a strong military and lots of dudes named Frederick, and all of this is true, and we'll come back to Prussia in a big way later. In fact, it will be the major unifying force in creating the nation of Germany in the 1870s. But there's more that's going on in Prussia at this time than just developing a military. The Prussians are also developing the system of education that will dominate Western thought for the next 400 years. Allow me to explain some of what I mean quickly. The Prussians are the first European society that creates public education through local taxes. While you and your families choose not to have you attend for one reason or another, choose to not have you attend public school for one reason or another, this is still the global standard today. People pay taxes to support the creation of public schools. Prussia is the first place to really emerge with a system of public education, though. Rather than your education being something that you paid a church tutor for, education was provided by the collective, provided by society, because it was seen as beneficial to society as a whole. In particular, we have the Prussians to thank for one of the traditional ages at which we begin our educations. When do so many children start school? Kindergarten, age 5. There's a reason why that thing has a German word. In fact, within a century, the Prussians will not just be in the business of providing schools, but requiring schooling for children ages 5 through 13. If you like the fact that you are in an air-conditioned building with people who want to see you do well, then thank Frederick the Great for creating a public education system that will ultimately be spread throughout the Western civilization. If you dislike it, well, I'm sure that we can open up a nice textile mill or a coal mine for you to lose your limbs in. But there's another drastic change that Prussians make to education during this time period, and that's the idea that education is about being able to perform tasks at the end of your education. How do you know that a student has learned something? They're able to do something that they couldn't do before. This is in contrast to the idea of the humanities or the liberal arts that we discussed during the Renaissance. How do you know if a Renaissance man is educated? Well, he's read the classics and he discusses their ideals, and you can see how the two have their differences. Classical education is about developing a sense of someone being a learned human being. The Prussian model of education is about making sure that human larvae have the skills that they need in order to survive. Both have their place in the world and within the school of education, but much of what Western education is now based on, and has been since the 19th century, is a Prussian model, which is a very militaristic, very results-oriented education model. How do you sit in a lot of classrooms? In rows, like the good soldiers that you are. Who gives you the information? The teacher, the commander. And who follows them? You do, good soldier. It's important that we take the time to understand Prussian culture as we are introduced to it in the text, because it's one of the ones that's most closely related to our own. I felt badly not including a picture on this slide, so here's the best royalty-free, copyright-free image I could find on Google image search for Prussian education model. It's a skeleton on a horse for some reason. There you go. Have that. One last item for us, and it's my brief spotlight from the last section on art and culture post-Renaissance. I want to give a quick shout out to, and put some questions in your head, about Caravaggio. Caravaggio was an Italian artist born in the years immediately post-Renaissance. And if you look at his art, you'll see that it looks like a lot of Renaissance art. He loves the religious themes, he loves the bright red, he sticks to the triangle composition, there's that chiaroscuro that we talked about with Renaissance art, realistic bodies, all of that jazz. But the tone of Caravaggio's work moves him out of the Renaissance period and into what we will call the Baroque movement in art. We'll take a look at more of it closely in class, but in fact he's seen during his life as being one of the most important painters to what was then modern or contemporary art. And this despite having a lifespan of only 38 years. A short lifespan and certainly an eventful one, as he spent a good portion of it getting into fights and being wanted for murder. He's kicked out of Rome by the Pope, who will have a death warrant on his head for the remainder of his life, and was known to always carry weapons and not be above throwing rocks at authority figures and starting fights. Certainly not a role model for us, which describes why it is that many of his works were actually attributed to more, shall we say, wholesome artists. But there's no denying the talent of Caravaggio. While I had to curate my images from Caravaggio's library to not show you any beheadings, really a favorite and recurring topic of his, here we see some images from Caravaggio. Here we have an image of the betrayal of Christ. Here we see a rather sullen-looking image of Saint Jerome. I want you to take a note of the tone of these two images. More somber, more violence, more death, less of that rebirth that we had seen during Renaissance art. What does Caravaggio's art tell us about the era in which he lived? Hopefully you can put it together, but I'll be interested in hearing your thoughts in class. Keep the dream alive, y'all, and Spartan up!